River Monsters takes me filming and fishing all over the world, and while we plan these expeditions meticulously, there's always one thing you can't control. That's the weather.
It looks quite gap-toothed, but actually pull those lips back and you see they're very spiky fangs underneath there.
Jeremy Wade was known for pulling monstrous fish from rivers most people feared to touch. Yet what lurked beneath the surface of his life was far more dangerous than a snapping jaw. Sickness, fear, loss, and even the law tested him in ways no expedition ever could. The man who braved the Amazon and Congo wasn't just wrestling with predators, he was wrestling with himself. Today, we uncover the hidden struggles, the arrest, the illness, the grief, and the higher purpose that emerges from pain. Boy of the River. Before he was the face of river monsters, Jeremy Wade was just a quiet boy on the banks of the River Stour in Suffolk, England. Born in Ipswich, he grew up in a household defined by routine and reflection. His father was a vicar, and life in their family carried the steady rhythm of church bells, sermons, and small-town simplicity. But Jeremy's imagination was already running downstream. The river near his home became his escape, a place that offered him more mystery than any book or sermon could. By the age of 7, he was already sneaking away with a simple rod and line. It wasn't about trophies or competition. Jeremy's earliest fishing trips were fueled by curiosity. He wanted to know what stirred beneath the rippling surface, why the water twitched in certain patterns, and how the unseen world of fish operated. The River Stour became his first classroom. Every cast was a question, every catch an answer. More importantly, he learned patience, an early training that would later define his career. Fishing was not just a pastime, it was a discipline. Hours could pass with no bite, but Jeremy learned to watch, to listen, and to sense changes in the water. That quiet focus would become his hallmark years later, when he sat motionless with a line in dangerous rivers, waiting for monsters most thought were myths. As a boy, however, it was simply his way of connecting with a world he felt drawn to, but didn't yet understand. Besides dreaming like most boys of football and city life, Jeremy fancied science. His inquisitiveness drove him towards studying zoology at Bristol University, where he got a more orderly view of ecosystems and biology. But he was still restless, even while schooled. The classroom might tell him the theories, but he sensed that the real lessons were waiting far out on a river that few outsiders had ever trodden. After graduation, he took a postgraduate teaching certificate in biological sciences. As he secured himself a stable life in teaching, he never intended to stay there for long. Deep in his heart, he wanted something much more risky and uncertain. He was not seeking fame, and certainly did not dream of being a celebrity. His call was wafting with interest, but a much stronger calling: to lay bare the truth about organisms living in that gray area between folklore and fact. This obsession saw him leave England in 1982 for an overseas holiday. With no money, no sponsorship, and absolutely no fallback, anything was possible. Jeremy set his sights on India. He had heard stories about the Himalayan mahseer, a giant golden-scaled fish that could reach the length of a man. It was said to hold the traits of power and elusiveness, a species that fueled the fantasies of any young naturalist. For Jeremy, it was not a matter merely of catching one. He longed to study, record, and come to know the living of such a creature. It was one bold decision, maybe reckless, for one who did not have much to recommend his solo sojourn, but some experience of an angler's paradise in England. Yet something of that kind identified him. From the rivers of Suffolk to the Himalayan foothills, Jeremy was moving through a world carved out of answers to questions no one else thought to ask. And in India, those questions would put him in more danger than he could ever have imagined. The arrest that changed him. Jeremy Wade's first great adventure nearly ended before it began. In 1982, fresh out of his studies and driven by stories of massive golden mahseer in the Himalayas, he left England with little more than a rod, a backpack, and a burning sense of curiosity. He was just 26 years old when he boarded a plane to India, believing the rivers of the north might hold answers to mysteries no textbook could solve. What he did not know was that this quest would soon lead him into one of the darkest episodes of his life. At first, his journey looked like a pilgrimage for any passionate angler. He moved from town to town by bus and train, camping near rivers, jotting notes in his journals, and talking with locals about the giant fish that lurked in the rapids. His questions were simple. Did the mahseer really reach lengths of 6 feet? How did they behave? Were they truly as powerful as the legends claimed? But in a time of political tension, a lone foreigner wandering villages near the Indo-Nepal border did not look like a harmless fisherman. To the local authorities, his equipment, cameras, notebooks, and strange devices, looked less like tools of science and more like the instruments of a spy. The day he was arrested came without warning. Jeremy had been staying near a small village when officials approached, suspicious of his activities. He tried to explain, but language barriers and paranoia drowned out his words. His zoology credentials meant nothing here. To them, he was a stranger with unusual equipment, lurking in restricted areas at a volatile moment in history. Within hours, he was accused of espionage and locked in a cell. What lay in wait was a real eye-opener for Jeremy, who later remembered feeling an incredible sense of helplessness. There were no embassy contacts and no lawyers to plead his case. He was made to repeat his story over and over again, each time cast into question by their eyes. Days turned into nights in the little cell. The heat was stifling, the food scanty, and the agony of uncertainty unbearable. He had come to India for fishing, and now he feared he would never see his home again. The isolation tormented him still. Back in Suffolk, his family had had no idea where he had been or what was happening to him. Worst-case scenarios ran through his mind. Would he simply vanish? Would anyone look for him? The rivers that had once called out with the promise of discovery and adventure now felt like borders, entrapments. Only luck could save him in the end from his ordeal. A local officer who heard the name mahseer stepped in. Not like the others, this man would understand Jeremy's story. Perhaps even he is into fishing himself. Little by little, he let go of all the tension as Jeremy finally managed to walk out. He walked free, but he was no longer the same man who had flown into the country a few weeks earlier. Jeremy spoke of his arrest as one of the most humiliating parts of his life. Not the physical abuse cut, but the seriously crushing uncertainty, that deep realization of how terribly fragile one's freedom is when so far from home. For days afterward, he could not bring himself to cast a line. Instead, he just sat quietly on the banks, looking into the waters that had once promised adventure, but now reflected fear and vulnerability. That just deepened his obsession with rivers. From here on, every journey would have the shadow of that cell hanging over it, reminding him that the real monsters could be human suspicion, misperceiving, and that thin line dividing curiosity and threat. And when he left Asia behind for the jungles of South America, that shadow would follow him, this time into a fight for his own survival. Near the point of no return. Few places on Earth carry the same blend of beauty and brutality as the Amazon. To scientists, it is a living laboratory. To locals, a lifeline. For Jeremy Wade, arriving there in the early 1990s, it was both a dream and a gamble. a place where whispers of man-eating fish had drawn him across the ocean. He wanted answers. Were the stories of monstrous arapaima, vicious red-bellied piranha, and stingrays capable of crippling a man true, or just myths? Jeremy had no production crew, no safety net, no easy way out, only fishing gear, notebooks, and a quiet determination to face what most feared. The river overwhelmed him immediately. The Amazon was not a line through the jungle, but an ocean in its own right, stretching wider than cities, swallowing anything careless enough to drift too close. Traveling with local fishermen, Jeremy pushed into remote tributaries few outsiders ever saw. They hacked through vegetation with machetes, strung hammocks between trees, and lived on what the forest offered. The true danger, however, came from within. Weeks of drinking questionable water, eating sparingly, and pushing through relentless humidity broke him down. At first, he dismissed the dizziness and fatigue, but then the fever hit. What once was fatigue would become something much worse. It felt like his head was pounding, his whole body quaking, and vomiting was dehydrating him. Each effort to rise was met with a collapse into the hammock. He would later describe it as being trapped inside your own failing body. The jungle did not help. Mosquitoes swarmed through the clouds, storms rolled in, and the river brought invisible threats in its relentless currents. Sometimes he thought he was not going to make it. What lay ahead was hundreds of miles to the nearest hospital, an almost impossible evacuation. Fishermen guarded him at night, praying that the fever would break. Lying there, sweating under the forest canopy, while the haunting howls of monkeys rose and fell, he imagined death would come not in the jaws of a predator, but in the embrace of an intangible parasite. And yet, he survived, be it by subconscious effort, local treatment methods, or pure luck. The fever would eventually pass. He rose, gaunt and weak, but alive. At that moment, a catch came, carving the expedition into his memory eternally. Against overwhelming odds, he managed to land an arapaima, one of the heaviest freshwater fish in the world. Measuring over 7 feet long and weighing more than 200 pounds, this prehistoric giant looked like a leftover from another age. For Jeremy, holding it was a triumph, personally and scientifically. The jungle had nearly slain him, but had also given him the one thing he most wished for. And so he emerged thinner, humbled, and fundamentally changed from the Amazon. He knew now that this chase for monsters was also a chase for humility. The rivers were not his to conquer. They were reminders of human frailty, of how small even the strongest could feel against nature's indifference. But not every challenge came from wild waters. Some came from losses too painful to share, shaping him in ways no one ever saw on screen. Grief off camera. Jeremy Wade built a career facing the world's most dangerous rivers, wrestling fish that looked like myths made flesh. On screen, he was the calm, steady voice guiding viewers through fear and survival. But the cameras could not capture everything. Off camera, Jeremy carried a private grief, one that never became part of the show, yet quietly shaped the man audiences came to admire. Unlike stingrays or sharp-toothed catfish, this battle was invisible. It was not about monsters in the water, but about loss closer to home. Those who worked alongside him noticed the change as the years passed. In the early seasons of River Monsters, he carried the wide-eyed intensity of an explorer surprised by the mysteries he uncovered. His voice was curious, almost playful. By the later seasons, there was a weight to him. His pauses lingered. His reflections circled mortality and solitude. Jeremy never confirmed the details. He preferred the rivers to speak louder than his private life. Yet whispers from colleagues suggest that during the show's peak, he endured the loss of someone deeply close. Some speculated it was a partner unable to keep up with his lifestyle. Others believed it was a family member's death. The truth remains unclear, but the impact was unmistakable. On camera, small signs slipped through. In one episode along a Southeast Asian river, Jeremy grew silent during a monologue, then handed narration back to the crew and walked into the jungle alone. He returned nearly an hour later, not explaining. The moment never aired, but those present remembered the weight of a man carrying something heavier than fatigue. He coughed up the grief in his writing. He sat down by the river and realized, the water is not going to listen to your sadness, but will just go on. 9 words less revealing than any interview, yet more powerful than any interview. Not bitter, but a realization of nature's indifference against the frail integrity of human loss. Grief is an important one that follows a man running all his life behind legends, and nowhere else has he failed to outwit or escape it. But she colored the stories he told, showing much more compassion toward the villagers whose tales and losses were the subjects of his investigations. When the villagers said they had children drowned or were missing under mysterious circumstances, Jeremy's answers were compassionate as if he had suffered a loss, with no answers. This unsaid grief may have actually been the most life-changing event in his life. The myth that adventure was only about winning was stripped bare, and his journeys took on the nature of mirrors. The rivers reflected his own struggles at him, the isolation of currents, the uncertainty of storms, how quickly things could go wrong. And yet, that did not stop grief. If anything, it moved him along. He came back to the rivers not really for a distraction, but to confront what had been taken from him. Throwing a line into wild water became a search for meaning, continuity, and connection. Jeremy Wade never invited the world's audience into his own suffering. But for those looking closely, it was there, in the heaviness of his narration, the silence between catches, the way he would linger over the word loss. Off camera, he bore the weight of grief. On camera, he turned it into stories that connect us not only to monsters of the river, but also to the fragility of life itself. And from that fragility came something stronger, the mission that would drive him through pain, danger, and exhaustion, no matter the cost. The toll and the mission. From the outside, river monsters looked like pure adventure. Jeremy Wade chasing legendary creatures across the globe. But beneath the suspense was a harder truth. The punishing toll the work took on his body, and the deeper mission that kept him going. By the time the series launched in 2009, Jeremy was already in his 50s. While many of his age slowed down, he was hauling 100-pound fish from wild rivers, slogging through swamps, and trekking through jungles where heat and humidity broke even the strongest. There were no stunt doubles, no staged fights. Every cut and scar was his own. The risks were constant. In Papua New Guinea, dengue fever left him weak and racked with pain. Most would have evacuated, but Jeremy kept filming. In the Amazon, a thorn near a vein threatened sepsis. In Argentina, a stingray nearly crushed him to the riverbed. Time and again, the waters reminded him that survival was never assured. Even the small injuries accumulated. Festering cuts, insect bites, strained muscles, the endless fatigue of continent-hopping schedules. Some mornings, he admitted, the hardest task was lacing his boots. Age amplified the cost, and his body became a map of scars, proof of years lived on the edge. However expensive the toll, the mission was worth it. In time, Jeremy discovered that river monsters was never really about fish after all. These so-called monsters were usually miscast creatures who had been pushed to extremes due to human interference. Pollution, overfishing, and climate change were the driving forces behind the very legends he chased. A stingray attack was very rarely random. It was usually linked to poisoned waters. A person feared with a catfish was a species struggling for survival. It was dangerous, not just because it was dangerous. As Jeremy put it, you start with a monster, but what you find is a bigger story about the people who live with that fear. That was the insight that turned a show into a purpose. He was not only capturing fish for television, he was uncovering these feeble ties between riverines and human extinction. That was indeed his mission, which was rarely shown to the viewer. He would give life jackets and train children in swimming in those villages where children died from drowning. He highlighted polluted places whose failing ecosystems were evident in the conflicts arising between people and wildlife. The incidents didn't go into the final cut, but became quietly the reasons why he kept pushing through pain and danger. That toll fused into the mission. The infection, the bruise, and every night spent shivering became part of something so much greater. The truth about rivers and people and the monsters we call monsters. For Jeremy, that truth came at a price called pain. In the end, River Monsters was never just a series about the fearsome fish. It was far more about fragility, the rivers that sustain us and the humans bound to them. Obviously, Jeremy Wade had a pretty heavy toll, but it was much, much heavier for his mission. And that, more than scars or survival, is what kept him stepping back into waters most would never dare to enter. Jeremy Wade's greatest catch wasn't a fish. It was clarity, that the real monsters are fear, fragility, and the costs we hide. Which part of his journey struck you most? Tell us below. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe for more untold journeys, and ring the bell. And don't miss the next video on your screen. We've got another powerful story waiting for you.